Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guests today are Maria Richards and Joe Batir. Maria Richards is the Southern Methodist University Geothermal Laboratory Coordinator in the Huffington Department of Earth Sciences. Maria's research focus is geothermal resources and energy development, with a current concentration on the conversion of oil and gas fields into geothermal energy producers. Joe Batir is an exploration geoscientist with Petrolern in Dallas. Joe has exploration experience in the Gulf Coast, East Texas, South Texas, Permian Basin, and in Alaska. Maria, Joe, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Thank you for inviting us, Todd.
Yes, thank you. Very excited to be here.
Great. Well, I've been looking forward to this discussion ever since we received your journal article, and we'll get to that here in a little while. But first, let's start out with your backgrounds in water. Maria, can you kind of tell us when you first became interested in water?
Sure. I grew up with a family that was very focused on water. I was in Michigan, which is the Great Lakes state. So I think from early on, I loved water. My degree as a master's degree is in watershed management. And then I came to SMU and was able to get a job with Dave Blackwell in the SMU Geothermal Lab. And so then I started looking deeper into water with the Geothermal Resources.
So where in Michigan?
I grew up near the Detroit area in Farmington, Michigan, and then also in Adrian, Michigan, which is near Ann Arbor.
Okay.
I'm a Michigan State graduate.
I went to the U of M. Graduate school, so I don't know how this is going to go. No, it's going to go well. That's great. That's great. Joe, how about you? When did you first become interested in water?
Yes, I was thinking about this question because that's not a question you think about every day, even though we need water every day to live. But some of the first thoughts that I had was that I grew up fishing and I enjoyed that aspect of water. And starting in undergrad, thinking about the way that water slowly breaks down rocks, that was another aspect of how the interaction between the subsurface and water and how that ends up creating cool rock formations. But then also with geothermal, how we can produce energy from those water resources. So I think it's always been there. And one thing that I was just thinking about, I grew up in Illinois in a small town called Shanahan, which I forget which indigenous language it is, but it means where the waters meet because it's where the Illinois and the DuPage River meet and then eventually flow down into some other river.
Oh,
so
very interesting.
It's always been a part of me, as it is all of us.
Great. Well, Maria, let's move to you next. And, I've got on here that I'd really like you to kind of tell us about geothermal energy and what advantage, it has as a power source over other power sources. And just, kind of thinking that, this is really a, water podcast. We don't normally get to talk too much about energy. And so that is, why I'd really kind of like to get the basics down first.
Sure, that makes sense. So in thinking about the basics, geothermal energy is a product from the earth giving off heat that goes all the way back from the core and the creation of earth, and it's slowly cooling down over billions and billions of years. And so, but right now there's heat still being generated and coming to the surface. And so Joe and I are an example of two people who look at the ability to tap into this energy and then combine it in a manner, often with water, which is why it's on this podcast, that you can then take that water with heat in it and extract the heat from, or some of the heat from that water, and then generate power from it. So within geothermal energy, there's the ability to use the heat directly, such as ground source heat pumps that many of your listeners might be familiar with. So you can heat it to heat or cool a building. You can also use it directly as a way to, from everything from like drying onions and produce to large scale district energy systems, where you're able to still use that heat or cooling for a large business complex. And then there's the electricity side of it. And that's usually the most exciting to people, to realize that we can produce clean, renewable energy from geothermal energy, just that heat inside the earth.
So, Joe, can you describe how, we take the geothermal energy and produce power for the grid, and the ways we can convert it to electricity?
Yeah. When it comes to converting that to electricity, so as Maria was explaining, we are producing thermal energy. So that thermal energy you can use to heat your homes or some other direct use where you need that heat. But you can also take that heat and convert that into mechanical energy, either letting that water flash to steam. That flashing process produces a mechanical energy that can then spin a turbine to then generate electricity. And then that electricity you hook up to the grid and you can move it all about the country. If the water, and that of course requires the water to boil, going from that liquid into that vapor. But if you've got lower temperature fluids or lower temperature water, you can also do that same process through what's called a binary geothermal power system. So you can take that heat, exchange it with something that boils at a lower temperature, that being some type of refrigerant, R134A or isopentane or isobutane. Those boil at a much lower temperature. So you can exchange that heat, turn that refrigerant into that steam, and have that run and spin the turbine. And then that produces electricity, and then you can put that on the grid.
So, Maria, is geothermal making a significant contribution at this point to American energy supplies? And what do you think the potential is for geothermal in the future?
So geothermal energy, what's unique about the United States is that we produce the most geothermal power in the world. Most people think about Iceland or New Zealand, or where there are lots of volcanoes. But as a country, we produce more geothermal power than them. In terms of the United States, though, in our consumption, we actually are producing about somewhere in the 1% of all total electricity is from geothermal power. So it's a very small power source at this current moment, but yet it's growing. And I think that's one reason why we did, worked on the article, and why Joe and I are continuing to research geothermal energy, is because there's lots of opportunity to work with the oil and gas industry and their fields to develop geothermal power, as well as the fact that, I mentioned direct use and that district energy systems and ground source heat pumps. Rather than having to produce power, geothermal helps us reduce the need for that power. And so it's a way of saving energy without having to produce it.
Joe, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the one thing that Maria said there that was really important to highlight is the fact that we can use that heat directly to reduce the amount of electricity we need. So the significant contribution that geothermal can make to the total energy use is not only the electricity that it can produce, where we are the number one nation in the world producing that electricity, but we can also significantly supply the heating that we need, which means we don't need to produce additional electricity as we are growing in all of our energy needs.
So I've been to Iceland, and I saw lots of examples of geothermal energy being used there. But I mean, where are some places that it would be easy to see, geothermal in use here in the U.S. or even in Texas?
So in California, a lot of the power for San Francisco and Northern California comes from geothermal power. So there's something called the geysers, and the geysers field is the largest geothermal field in the world. And so you're going to find that Northern California, as well as Southern California, has the hottest geothermal, largest field with the Salton Sea area. And then there's Nevada and Utah, Oregon, Idaho. Those are all states. So mainly Western United States is where it currently is. And that's why it's interesting for what we've been researching to show that there's a lot of heat stored right here in Texas as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the reason we haven't, really developed geothermal as much as we could have before now? Is it just because we have so many other, power sources that we've got to take advantage of, or there's just kind of a big, industry focused on it and all the constituencies in place to promote it and make its use more widespread?
One of the great things about the United States is the fact that we don't pay very much for our energy. Most young people, when they turn on that electrical switch, when they turn on a light bulb, they don't even know where that's coming, or the hot water for their homes. And that's because we have very cheap power. Whereas countries that have higher cost tend to work more with renewables, and geothermal energy is renewable. So it tends to be more expensive up front in comparison to some of the oil and gas and coal and those sorts of products that we are so used to, versus the desire to have a cleaner both atmosphere and water quality and energy source.
Joe, you want to add something?
Yeah, one more thing that I'd like to add here that has been a major focus recently in terms of the research is that in many areas, the geothermal resource is not at the surface. You don't physically know that it's there. And that's the case for much of Texas specifically, is where the data that we were looking at are 10, 15,000 feet underneath the subsurface, where you start to get that geothermal resource that you can produce. And you don't really get that coming up to the surface in any clear, obvious way. So where you've got the sun shining or the wind blowing and you can feel that resource and you can think, what can I do with this? Unless you live near a hot spring, or unless you live near Yellowstone, or unless you know about hot water, you don't really think about how can you turn that thing that is there into a usable end product, being electricity or heating for your home.
Yes, exactly what I was thinking about was Montana, and not only Yellowstone, but an area of Montana that I spend time in that's got hot springs, and just kind of like something I don't remember seeing here in Texas. Although I don't know, maybe there are hot springs.
Actually, keep in mind, in Texas, there's mineral wells,
right?
And that's because that was hot springs. And then Waco, the name Waco for the city of Waco that word means geysers. It used to be known as the city of geysers. And so 100 years ago, if we were there, they literally had water streaming out of the ground. So
now we've got some groundwater depletion in those areas, and
right.
And so it's not obvious like it used to be.
Correct.
So, Maria, your current research focusing on conversion of oil and gas wells into geothermal energy producers, really caught my attention. So, because I was, thinking about this issue of, there are all these wells, and the oil and gas industry has leases, I guess, for those wells, and do they also have options to try turn them into geothermal energy wells? And, would they have to, how would they do that? Would they just have to make them deeper? Or, can you talk a little bit about what that might look like?
Sure. The oil and gas industry overlaps with the geothermal industry in that we're both focused on what is below the ground and usually fairly deep below the ground, like thousands of feet below the ground. And then there's also the focus of reservoirs. The oil and gas industry is focused on finding and using the oil and gas reservoirs, whereas the geothermal industry is focused not on groundwater that you would drink, things that are much deeper, that are here in Texas especially, are very heavily brined water. So Texas used to be an inland sea, and during that time when it was an inland sea, that our formations were filling up with a salty brine water from that. And so that's the water that we're interested in tapping into. In Texas, then, the idea is that the oil and gas industry drill through these salty formations to get to the oil and or gas, or both, that they're looking for. And there would be the ability to go back and perforate the zones that have the water to flow it. What I'm aware of is that it could sound easy, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And that the oil industry and geothermal industry are similar, but we're not the same. And so that's one of the difficulties.
So are you talking about the same well producing oil possibly, but also producing geothermal energy? Or is this, you can only do one of these at a time and you've got to, task it for that?
Right now, the way the oil industry works, it would be difficult from my perspective to be tapping into one well that's already, a strong flowing well that's got oil and gas. They're not going to want to take a successful well and start flowing water in it, because it is a lot more difficult in terms of separating it at the surface, as well as the way they pay people for those different formations and which ones are producing the oil and or gas for royalties and payback. So the goal would be to take a field that is at the end of its life and no longer producing the oil and gas like they want, rather than just shutting it in or abandoning it, to start looking at those wells and determining if it should be, if they should use those wells specifically, or if they need new casing and it's better to drill new wells. So there's a lot of additional reasons to either re-drill a well and or just drill fresh new wells that have wide diameters and fresh casing and things like that for all the parameters and environmental protection we need.
So tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like maybe there is some way that you could do both at the same time, or some places maybe that they have wells that are configured such that you could develop both resources at the same time.
Yes. One of the tests of this went back in the early 2000s, was up in Wyoming, and they worked on a well that they converted, and in the Casper area, and that well produced both oil and water, and so they were to separate the two. And the same thing is in North Dakota. So yes, here in Texas we could certainly do that, but it's just not something that most oil companies want to be combining. They avoid water, whereas if you want to be geothermal, you've got to produce water.
Yeah. I also, it seems to me that if you're somebody who has property in an area where the oil is kind of end of its life, and those fields are pretty fully tapped, that this would be something you might be pretty excited about. Here's another potential future source of revenue as a landowner, that a company could come in and take the infrastructure that was originally built for oil and gas development and use it for geothermal.
Yes, that is exactly it. And so there's royalties not related to necessarily the amount of fluid flow, but more related to the amount of heat extracted.
Huh. Joe, do you want to add something?
I was just going to point out that what Maria was saying, and when you think about an oil well, their main target is oil or gas. So a gusher or a good oil well is going to have a pretty low water cut. So that water, and typically what we think about is extracting that heat from the water portion. So while there are plenty of examples of co-production, as you're talking about, and there are more of those opportunities, especially in the end of life fields that Maria pointed out. But as she was saying, it is one of those things that if you have good wells and you're really good at your job and getting really good oil and gas wells, they probably aren't producing the amount of water that you need to actually generate electricity for geothermal.
Gotcha. Well, Joe, let's stay with you. Why don't you tell us about your recent article, the article that you and Maria prepared for the Texas+Water Journal, determining geothermal resources in 3 Texas counties. I'm interested in what you both set out to determine in your research that's described and what you found.
Yeah. So to give the Cliff Notes version, and before I say that, I suggest everybody go out, find the article and read it, because it is great research. Maria did great work with it, and I did a lot of work with it that Maria made better. So highlighting that. So definitely go find it and read it. But to give the Cliff Notes version, the primary goal of that work was to highlight what the geothermal resources were in 3 separate areas, that being kind of the tail end of the Permian Basin, co-located with university lands. This work was funded through, it was a joint project that we did in collaboration with a group out of the University of Texas system. So also focusing on university lands. That was the Crockett County portion, and then going south into Webb County, looking at the Eagleford Shale and all of the work that's actively being done in the Eagleford right now, and then moving further over to the east into the kind of the true core of the Gulf Coast into Jackson County, basically looking at these 3 different areas, looking at how they all interplayed and interconnected, and then saying what potential areas are there for future geothermal exploration and hopefully further development. And how can we use the new drilling and the new data to highlight those areas and see what kind of differences there were. And then the second part of that, I think the important part is that as we get more data, one of the big conclusions is that as we get more data, we are seeing more potential resources in terms of geothermal resources. But those resources are, what's the right word? They are, it's higher resolution, which ultimately drives more variability. So if you look at previous heat flow maps for the US, all developed by the most recent, there's an iteration of maps all from the SMU Geothermal Lab going back to 1992. And what you can see in those maps is a slow increase in resolution. So if you look at the 1992 map, you might find an area that looks great for geothermal. And you may say, okay, I could drill anywhere in this section. But now looking at the work that we've done, you may not be able to just find a super hot red spot on the map and drill a well. It requires more understanding than just that. I think that's one of the big main conclusions, is that as we get more data, we want to analyze it so that we can understand the intricacies and the granularities and the variabilities within the resource beneath our feet.
Maria, do you have anything you want to add to that?
So I'm glad that Joe pointed out the fact that the results of what we did really almost increase the amount of unknown. And part of that is that there's new ways of calculating temperatures that are as deep as 10 kilometers. And one of the things we did as part of that was to start using more of the radiogenic heat production that's naturally occurring and understanding the sedimentary thickness. And so by going back and looking at seismic data, which is now much more detailed than it was, even 10 years ago, and then some of the other type of like gamma rays and things like that, where you can understand the radiogenic heat production side of it, you combine those two, and we have a better conversion of what's happening at the surface and then projecting it to deeper temperatures. And so we've increased the amount of heat in some places to more than what was originally predicted when we did the 2004 map, when Dave Blackwell and I did that map of, which is the geothermal map of North America. And even the Google map that Joe was part of as a graduate student in 2011. And so it's exciting to continue to take research and expand it and use it. And so this is a good opportunity to show that.
So I'm curious why you picked Crockett, Jackson, and Webb counties. Are those kind of the areas that you think are maybe kind of the sweet spots in Texas for geothermal?
So when it comes to why we picked those three specifically, I think as I mentioned earlier, it was kind of a way to look at different areas for various reasons and for a kind of a look kind of across Texas. But to dig in a little bit more, Crockett County, really the hard focus there was the overlap with university lands. So we wanted to say, large scale picture, what if oil and gas goes away? What other resources, subsurface, could university lands be developing leases for or developing some type of revenue stream on? Then with Webb County, there was the high amount of Eagle Ford data associated with it. It was kind of the tail end of the Eagle Ford play, so that at least on the U.S. side. So that was one aspect. There was a lot more data. So that was an opportunity to see just how does this additional data add into the way the map is being created. And to your point there were a few different higher heat flow values that we wanted to explore a little bit more. And then the other aspect was the relation to Laredo and having this high population center that could utilize the amount of energy that, if it's there, could be produced. And then going into Jackson County was actually a little bit different because there were all of these counties along the Gulf Coast that didn't really have a whole lot of new data. So there it was, how is what we're doing impact these changes when we don't really have a huge increase in data resolution, but instead we're looking at different ways of calculating the heat flow. So there, I think we went from, I think it was about 150 data points up to maybe 300 data points. It was still really low resolution compared to Crockett or Webb that I think went from 500 data points up to 2,000 data points each. So there was a significantly lower amount of increased data in Jackson County. That's what I remember from it. Maria, what do you remember? Why did we choose those three?
I think what you said was correct. Just basically it was related to the UT Austin project, where the lands are, as well as wanting to work around appropriate cities that could use the heat as we found it for geothermal resources or direct energy. And then also wanting to better understand the Gulf Coast, which is why we chose Jackson, and the fact that it was Central Gulf Coast.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So what do you think, Joe, in terms of what you found that the potential is for geothermal power in Texas. And Maria, please weigh in on this. This is kind of the central question. What's the potential for it really to make up a big chunk of our energy supply, and what kind of time frame would we be looking at if the state really put the money and effort into geothermal energy?
Maria, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Joe.
Okay. So there's a few different aspects that I think are important to point out here. One, the resource is there. I think we identified that there are areas that have that hot water that we think can be produced. And this is really, this work is confirmation of that, using these new tools and new workflows. But even going back to 2011, I think, Marie, you can correct me, for the I-35 report, we've known that this resource is here. It's really just a matter of figuring out the details on how do you drill the wells, how do you produce that, and how do you do all of that economically and build the business model behind it. And the one thing I want to highlight here is that our research continues to show that this resource is there. And now you're starting to see the business behind it, with multiple different startups starting in Houston, starting in that energy capital of the world. And then you're starting to see multiple different projects. And now, most recently, Texas having a lease sale that includes geothermal leases that show that now they're starting to build out this geothermal ecosystem that will hopefully have a project online, or at least geothermal wells being drilled next year, is what I would hope for.
Maria, you want to add?
In addition, what I think, we have focused on producing water. And this might be a good point to highlight the fact that the industry is changing. And that's one reason why I think the oil and gas industry is looking at geothermal power, because they have changed. They have new drilling techniques and new ways with their lateral and horizontal, drilling to follow heat sources that weren't there before, as well as they can make a well rather than just being vertical and let's say 8,000 feet. They can now go horizontally a mile, and so that changes how you extract heat from the ground. And there's a lot more research now on developing a single borehole for geothermal power. So rather than needing to produce water, at the surface, it comes out and then re-inject it. People are looking into using a single borehole where you would have something like a giant closed loop system for even a home now as underground for generating power. So the types of wells are changing, but also the drilling and the capacity and how we drill is changing. And all of those are going to be impacting both the oil and gas industry as well as the geothermal industry for the power side of it.
I'm just trying to make sure that I understand kind of the potential. You're saying that this is a significant potential source of future energy for the state, not just kind of a minor player potentially, but something pretty significant in the long term.
Yes. In fact, just in terms of how much heat is there, underneath, like all of not just Texas, but under the United States, there's more power, more heat waiting to be converted to power than as if we were to take all the power we produce today and produce it for another 100 years. It's just, sitting there waiting to be, tapped into. And so there's a lot of heat that's just being evaporated with, at the surface. But also the interesting thing about Texas is that all these sedimentary basins that we have, those actually act as a blanket, and they're helping to keep the heat in. And that's one reason why Texas is an important state, and because we have hotter formations than other states that don't have the sedimentary formations.
Well, it's almost like the Texas being the power, or superpower of power.
Right.
Whatever you want to say for the future: oil, gas, wind, solar, geothermal.
Exactly.
It's that story just seems to keep expanding, and makes me think. Well, if we were able to produce a lot of electricity with geothermal, I guess we'd still have to use it here unless we were interconnected with grids in other parts of the country, like we're not at the present.
And the goal for geothermal energy is it can be a distributed power because you're working on using resources that are below ground and you can tap into them by using a well or drilling a well. Those allow you to use them more on site. So rather than having to build the big power grids like we did with the wind industry, the goal would be is to use it on site more locally. So, but Todd, something that just came to my mind that I think might be of interest to you and your listeners is the fact that we've also been talking about heat a lot with this and power. But Joe and I did a project in East Texas where we were looking at taking the geothermal fluids and that heat and using absorption type chillers to create super cold water that would then be stored during the day, well, actually at night. And then in the day when we needed to have more efficiency of a natural gas plant, the water was going to be used to cool the inlet temperature. As it turns out that most natural gas plants, they start losing efficiency somewhere around like 60 degrees to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you think about Texas, most of our days, we are above 60 degrees in the middle of the day. And so if we could use geothermal to cool water and then make our natural gas plants more energy efficient, that's a win-win for two industries, as well as everybody in the area.
Yeah.
Well, that's a unique, way to think about that I hadn't thought of before, for sure. Using geothermal for some other way to make, natural gas use more efficient. Are there any, projects kind of exploring that use at this point, or do you see that, elsewhere in the United States being done?
So there's not that I am aware of. That doesn't mean it's not happening. But I'm also been working with Ken Wiesian, who's out of the Bureau of Economic Geology, and they're starting to look at coal plants and how can we start converting coal plants and using that infrastructure as the foundation of a geothermal power. And so it's kind of like a multi-year or many-year conversion from coal to geothermal power. And a lot of the coal plants have oil and gas wells on their property as well. So it's a way of, once again, combining resources to make it efficient and as well as make it more seamless in terms of how do we convert from one to the other.
Joe, do you want to add anything here?
The only thing that I'll add there is a little anecdote. So I used to go camping at Fairfield Lake State Park, and Fairfield Lake was always it was essentially a cooling pond for an old coal-fired power plant. And there was a period where I think that plant has been decommissioned, but so the lake itself is no longer heated, and it had a period of time where it had tilapia growing in it. And they were able to live year round in this lake because of the cooling aspect and because it was artificially warmer than typical Texas summers. That is, or not summers, winters. And that is one of those aspects where you can see a cascaded use. If we could go back into those coal plants, repurpose them for geothermal, use that lake for cooling, maybe you could also have that fishing or agriculture industry behind it.
Another unique application. Maria, this podcast is all about water, of course. So, tell us a little bit more about the importance of water in the geothermal power equation.
Well, we've obviously mentioned water and or brine many times. So right now, the traditional geothermal industry for power is built on water. As we move forward, I think that that's going to be changing, especially as we get to the ability to use one single borehole. That's definitely helpful because we're not going to be, we won't be using water most likely for that exchange of heat. It'll be a different medium. But the other thing is that the industry, as it has already transitioned to binary type power plants, those binary technologies are bringing water or brine to the surface. It's actually being used to heat a secondary fluid that then flashes the steam. And then that water is just re-injected. But so the water pretty much never sees in any atmospheric, air. It's all kept inside of pipes. And by doing that, the geothermal industry is already very much a conservation of water. And so we realize that, water is very important. Geothermal is a green, renewable energy and clean. We talk about that. So for us, making sure that the water component is part of that cycle is very, very important to us as an industry.
Well, Joe, you want to add anything to that?
Nope. I think Maria said it perfectly. Nothing else there to comment on.
All right. Well, this is our last question. It's a question for both of you. And Maria, if you want to go first, please tell us how our listeners can find out more about your work.
So I work at SMU in the Geothermal Laboratory. I'm within the Department of Earth Sciences. And so someone could start out by typing in Maria and geothermal. They could go to SMU and they could, so there's lots of information on our website. But I also wanted, for listeners who are into data and understanding some of the bigger pictures of geothermal energy, there's also something called the Geothermal Data Repository, the GDR. And that's a government website that I think has a lot of newer research where every single group that has a Department of Energy grant has to put the data onto there. So there's a lot of data that people can get access to. And the other neat thing about even our website is that we have the National Geothermal Data System. We're one of the nodes, and that gives people the ability to see the historic aspects of the geothermal community and and magazines and books and articles and things like that too.
Great. Joe, how about you?
Yes. Well, I just wanted to thank you, Todd, for having us on your show today. If anybody wants to find out more about me or what I'm up to, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search Joseph Batir. And one more thing, I'll give a shameless plug. I have my own podcast. It's called Energy Transition Solutions. It is all about the energy transition. So I think your viewers will understand that water is going to be a big question mark and a big topic in the energy transition. So I do have people on that talk about carbon credits and eco credits and all sorts of energy. And hopefully we'll be having more people talking about water and water aspects to the energy transition as well. So you can find me on LinkedIn and find all that information on there.
And Joe is great on LinkedIn. For those who are on social media, Joe is known in the geothermal community as being one of our leaders. So
great. And just to kind of follow up what you're saying there, Joe, you can't talk enough about water. No one can do that. And so I'm all for more talk about water. And today, though, was great to talk about energy for a change and a little water, but mostly energy, which was all very new and interesting to me. So, Maria, Joe, thank you for joining us today.
Todd, you're very much welcome. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Todd.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. This has been Talk+Water. My guests today were Maria Richards and Joe Batir. Maria Richards is the Southern Methodist University Geothermal Laboratory Coordinator in the Huffington Department of Earth Sciences. Joe Batir is an exploration geoscientist with Petrolern in Dallas. I also want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast today. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to flow. My name is Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.